First of all, let me say what an absolute privilege it is to be up here. As Joe says, we've known each other for some time. I've watched him guide Heartland in the direction of what I believe is actually the most, or should be, the most important policy objective we have, and that is enhancing individual freedom and preventing the shift of power and influence to government, which basically erodes that freedom. I'm so proud as I've watched Joe guide Heartland on what he has done, what Heartland has done, and when he told me he was going to have the key supporters of Heartland here, I just had to come and first of all give my thanks, because without your support, none of what has been accomplished would ever have been done. Now, let me just say that. So it is a real privilege, and I feel very sincere about that. Let me say to begin with that each of us has some basic beliefs that help us guide us through our lives. And I've had two long-standing beliefs. One, I believe there is a God and he cares for us. And two, I believe individual freedom is the real source for happiness and prosperity. Now, I've had those beliefs for a long time. What I never realized until relatively recently is how interrelated those two beliefs happen to be. Now, I know not everyone believes in God, and that's okay. Just recognize that your belief doesn't change reality. I mean, either there is a God or there isn't. What we believe, one way or the other, isn't going to affect that. So if you don't believe in God, just humor me on some of these points. If you do believe in God, I believe you'll probably agree with me that he wants us to be happy and to be prosperous. But if you think about God for a minute, and I think about him a lot, he's a pretty smart guy. And one thing he knows is that he cannot impose happiness and prosperity on his people, because then we would become slaves to his happiness and to his impositions. It's a lot like in a rich country cannot impose some of those riches on his poorest people without them becoming slaves to that imposition. So God recognizes that people really are unique. They have to have free will, they have to have freedom, they have to have liberty to make the most out of their lives, for better or for worse. And it struck me not so long ago when I looked at this, that in giving us this concept of freedom and liberty, we also have God's prescription for happiness and prosperity. Now, how does that work? Well, it just turns out that the policies that give people the maximum amount of individual freedom also happen to be the policies that give people the greatest amount of goods for the greatest number of people, and that's prosperity. And I call those policies classical economic principles. And the policies I've narrowed down to just about 4, and they're not mine. They've been around for a long time. Basically, to give people the maximum amount of economic freedom, we have to give them low tax rates, limited government. We have to give them operation of free markets so that their choices can be respected, for better or worse. We have to protect their individual property rights, and we have to give them a stable currency with which to transact business. And lo and behold, it turns out that as I look and study what's happened in this country over a long period of time, what's happened throughout the rest of the world, what I consistently see is that whenever governments move in the direction of giving people more individual liberty, economic conditions improve for the greatest number of people. And whenever we move in the opposite direction, we end up with disappointing economic conditions. What we have done in the course of the past 5 years, and even to some extent the past decade, is we have seen the policies in this country move away from these classical economic principles that respect freedom, individual freedom. And when that happens, we have always had economic problems. We have economic problems today. It was only actually 2 weeks ago today, the president spoke and made the statement that the private sector is doing fine. Now, not only was that not a accurate statement, but it was the most incredible bit of bad timing that I have ever seen, because it was only 3 days later that every newspaper in the country had a front page story on a study from the Federal Reserve that showed that the typical American family's wealth had declined by 40% over the course of the 3 years from 2007 to 2010. And the income of the typical family was down almost 10%. And then in a slightly related story, it turned out that it was only about a month ago that President Obama released his tax returns. And it turned out that last year, the president made almost $1 million less than he had made the year before. Now think about what this means. Even Obama is doing worse under President Obama. Well, my objective today is threefold. I want to place current economic and financial developments in perspective. I want to clear up a lot of the confusion often surrounds these developments. And I want to try and describe a framework that I believe can be very helpful to you in trying to assess what has become an extremely confusing, complicated situation with respect to the economy. By way of organization, I'm going to begin with the framework, a brief description of the framework, and then I'm going to go on and, again, very briefly discuss 6 key areas. The first area I'm going to discuss is the weakness, the current weakness that has hit the U.S. economy. I'll then discuss the financial meltdown that occurred about 3.5 years ago. I'll discuss the European debt crisis. I'll discuss our own U.S. debt crisis. I'll then put some of these things together and look at the outlook, what it looks like for the next 6 months and beyond, and end up with a discussion of the election, including my assessment of who's going to win the presidential election. So that's the framework that we're heading on. Let me begin, if I can, with the discussion of the general economic weakness. I mentioned that we had moved away from classical economic principles. I've done a pretty extensive study going back over the past century where I've looked very closely at the growth in government spending and what happens when it grows faster or slower than spending in the private economy. And what I've found is that on almost every occasion, there's one exception, when government spending has grown above its normal rate of growth, above the economy's normal rate of growth, there is a significant deterioration in the private sector. And that's what's happened. If we look at the period from 2000 to 2005, we find that federal government spending, when I say government, I'm always referring to federal. Federal government spending increased 38% in that 5-year period, 2000 to 2005. Private spending went up 24%. The government's growing faster than the private sector, and that's a sign of weakness. But in the next 5 years, from 2005 to 2010, government spending went up 40%. Private spending went up 9%. A significant deterioration in the economy. And the other thing I will suggest is that private spending doesn't include, or public spending, federal spending, doesn't include all the potential damage that the federal government does to the private sector. I've done extensive analysis based on the work of a lot of other people on compliance costs, the cost of complying with federal mandates. And it turns out that in 2000, the estimate of what it costs in current dollars, roughly current dollars, it costs the economy about $1 trillion a year to comply with federal government mandates. By the end of the decade, it was up to $1.7 trillion a year. And my calculations, based on 3 programs, namely the healthcare legislation, the Dodd-Frank financial reform, and the EPA regulations, suggest that we are adding approximately $500 billion more to that total, a year, to that total compliance expenditure at the federal level. And the burden on the economy, on the private sector, of shifting all these things into complying with government spending or government mandates has simply been overwhelming. And that's why we have the weakness in the economy that we have. In terms of number two, the financial meltdown of the last year. To understand the financial meltdown, you have to understand Fed policy. I wrote an extensive piece on this, which appeared in the Budget and Tax newspaper that you did, so you can read the details. But in essence, there were two things that happened that caused the financial meltdown. The first thing is the Federal Reserve made some mistakes in monetary policy. As I measure monetary policy, and just about everyone agrees with this, they increased their liquidity too much in the first half of the decade. That's what created the boom in the economy. And starting in 2005, what they did is they started taking the money and liquidity out of the system. And they did something they hadn't done since the 1930s. They spent 3 years actually reducing the amount of bank reserves. Bank reserves are the first step in the monetary process. That weakened the economy. I don't believe that's what caused the financial meltdown. What caused the financial meltdown was another problem another government mistake, a colossal one. They were trying to figure out how to deal with the bankrupt government agencies, Fannie and Freddie. And basically, this was Treasury Secretary Paulson, Bernanke, Geithner, got together, and they didn't inform anyone else what they were doing. But they came out with a surprise statement at the beginning of September of 2008. And the surprise statement said, this is how we're going to deal with it. We're going to back the debt of these two entities, Fannie and Freddie debt, by 100% on the dollar. However, to protect the taxpayers, we're going to make the taxpayers senior creditors to both the preferred and the common stock. And while that sounded like it might be a reasonable course, what they did not realize is that the banking system, our banks, held $20 to $30 billion in Fannie and Freddie preferred stock. So with that one decision, they wiped out 20 to 30 billion of bank capital, creating a liquidity crisis. By the end of the week, Lehman Brothers fails. AIG runs into serious problems. There was a run on the money market funds. It's a worldwide economic liquidity crisis that was initiated by a very poorly constructed government policy. That's what caused the meltdown in the economy. And they have been trying to repair that ever since by having the Fed do all these convoluted ways of getting liquidity back into the system. So far, they haven't been terribly effective at doing that, and that's one of the reasons I believe we were not seeing this dramatic increase in spending. A third point, the European debt situation. It was last year one time, I think, there was a 400-point drop in the Dow Jones one day in our stock market because of news out of Italy. I think it was Jay Leno who said this was the worst Italian disaster since the Olive Garden started serving fettuccine Alfredo. and what it did is it kind of woke people up to the fact that what happens over in Europe can certainly have a major effect. Well, what's happening over in Europe? It's really pretty basic. European governments left classical economic principles several decades ago. And if you look at their growth, they basically had very sluggish growth for the past 2 decades. They also ended up promising much more in the way of government benefits than their economies can ever be expected to produce. So they've overpromised. There is one real solution to the European debt crisis, and that is they have to have massive cuts in government spending, and they have to lower their tax rates to encourage the private sector to produce faster growth. They've recently had a couple of elections, and to me at least, it's clear the public doesn't want to move in that direction. They want to move even further away from classical economic principles. So my conclusion on Europe is they are not even close to solving their problem. they've been putting together these, what I like to call financial gimmicks. Financial gimmicks are where you set up a rescue fund or a stability fund, a lot like our TARP fund. All those funds do is take credit that could be available to the private sector for productive use and switch it over to help support government activities. That's a negative impact on growth. So I believe Europe is going to continue to be a serious problem. What about the debt problem, the debt crisis right here in this country? We are one step behind Europe. And if you look at, what I like to look at is, well, what are the proposals? Is anyone proposing anything constructive? In Europe, no one is. Here, there has been a constructive proposal. And that is, you have the Ryan budget versus the president's budget. What does the president's budget do on spending? For the next 2 years, it has federal spending going up by 10%, a total of 10% over 2 years, on top of all the spending that's been done so far. The Ryan budget, 2 years from now, has federal spending down 4%, not a slow growth, an actual decline in federal spending by 4%. That's at least an assumption that we might start to move in a different direction. It's a plan. Whether or not it's going to be implemented, obviously gets into my last issue, and that's the election. And that would only be the first step of trying to decide whether it gets implemented. On the tax side, 2 years from now, the president's budget has government collecting, well, let me go first with the Ryan budget. It has government collecting a substantial increase in tax revenues. Both budgets assume that we're going to reinstate the payroll tax, and so that's a huge revenue grab. And there are lots of other taxes, even in the Ryan budget. That's one thing. The president's budget for revenues 2 years from now is that the government will take in $235 billion more tax receipts than the Ryan budget. So under both budgets, you get tax receipts going up. If you look at the long-term projections of the Ryan budget, our national debt goes from about $16 trillion today to $21 trillion in 10 years. That's even with the 4% cut. The president's budget obviously is much higher. And again, even under the Ryan budget, the interest payments per year on the debt here in the U.S. at assumed interest rates that are relatively low amount to $600 billion a year, which is almost what the president has as a defense budget as we go out. I'm still encouraged by the Ryan budget because at least it focuses on the near term for doing some action. Because then once you take that action, you can focus on the near term again for some other action. But basically, it's the only game in town for getting control of our long-term fiscal situation. So where are we headed on the federal budget? I'll defer until I get to my last topic, the election. What about the outlook for the economy? There was some talk this morning about tax Armageddon, whatever. The way I prefer to look at this, and I've put down the list of all the automatic tax increases that go into effect, is that if you do away with the Bush tax cuts alone, which happens automatically at the end of the year, unless legislation is changed, there will be roughly a 5 percentage point increase in everyone's income taxes, which means on top of the close to 10% decline in take-home pay in income over the course of the past 3 years that we talked about in the Fed report, you will have another immediate 5% decline in individual income. If you add the other taxes that will automatically change at the end of the year, I come to the conclusion that it will be a hit of roughly 9% to most people's income if those tax increases go into effect. That is a potentially huge destructive and destabilizing force on the economy. Aside from that, we have a situation today when I look at the economic outlook that reminds me a great deal of that great line from The Wizard of Oz. When Dorothy first lands in the land of Oz and looks around at all these strange goings-on, she turns to her dog Toto and said, "I have the feeling we're not in Kansas anymore." And that's the feeling I get when I look at the economy, not just because of the tax Armageddon, but also because of the mandates, the $500 billion in new mandates that the economy is expected to absorb, but also because of monetary policy. I've studied monetary policy extensively as one of my major areas of concentration, and when I look at what's happening today, we're not in Kansas anymore. We've got a huge amount of liquidity that has come into the economy and the banking system over the course of the past 12 months. A lot of people think it came in earlier. I do an analysis that says no, it didn't come in earlier, but it's been there for the past 12 months. And usually in normal times, 6 to 9 months after the Fed puts that liquidity in the system, you start to see an increase in spending in the economy. And so far, we're into June, and there are no concrete signs that there's any increase in spending. So at the very least, the spending increase is delayed. I believe one of the reasons it's delayed is because of Dodd-Frank, the cost of the $200 or so billion in mandated costs. I had dinner with the treasurer of Merritt Bank in Ohio recently, and he told me that they had just decided they were going to cut 11% of their staff, and had just announced it. And he said, we think we are in the vanguard of what other banks are going to have to do. He said the cost of these regulations is simply enormous. And in order for us to survive, we've got to get rid of 11% of our staff, and we just announced it. So I'm not talking out of line here. I think when you make the banking system and put it under that much stress, the banking system is a transmission mechanism, transmitting money to the economy. You have the potential to not have the money get through. And so that's what we're dealing with. What's spending going to do between now and the end of the year? Is it going to pick up, slow down? Frankly, I don't know. We are not in Kansas anymore. We have to realize that. Well, let me turn to the last topic that I wanted to talk about, and that's the election. I think it's fair to say, if we look at the president first, that he's not a real big fan of classical economic principles. I mean, he's made it really clear this time as to what his policies are going to be. But to have even greater clarity, there's a very extensive article that appeared a couple of days ago in the New Yorker entitled "The Second Term." And in that article, the author goes through and interviews a lot of Obama's staff, advisors, supporters, including quotes from the president himself. And the conclusion that I draw from the article is that if the president does win this election, he will become more radical than he has ever been before. And the really fascinating part of the article, at least what was fascinating to me, because it is a very long article, what was fascinating to me is when his advisors talk about what he's going to do right away in the second term, when he has this confrontation with the Republican Congress, or at least the Republicans in the House, on tax policy. And their conclusion is, what he will do is he will basically let the Bush tax cuts expire. If Congress does not change in the way he wants the tax system by the end of the year, he will let the Bush tax system. There will be a huge outcry, he knows. But they consider this to be very similar to when the government was shut down under Clinton. And Clinton stood his ground, and the public blamed the Republicans, and after a couple of weeks of outcries and letters and everything else, they gave in. And that gave the presidency, as his advisor, as Obama's advisor see it, far more stature. He's a strong man. He saw them down. He really ended up showing that he is a leader. So if you think that it's not possible for all these tax rates to go into effect, remember, we have someone here who wants to put more power and influence in the hands of government, and nothing helps that more than taking in more revenues. So And the other thing that I got out of the article, Joe, you would like this. The president himself said in his second term, his main focus will be on climate change. That will be that will set his agenda for the future. Now let's look at Governor Romney. What Governor Romney has said that I think is most significant is that he will repeal the healthcare legislation, the Dodd-Frank financial reform, and the most onerous of EPA regulations. If he does that, we are eliminating, according to my calculations, $500 billion of potential expenses that companies, individuals, whoever, have had to start to consider in the economy. And one thing we have today is we have record corporate profits, the highest share they've ever been in the post-World War II period, probably the highest share ever of the economy. And the question a lot of people have is why aren't businesses expanding? And one of the reasons I think is you want to make sure you can survive next year, depending upon what happens to your taxes and what happens to all these mandates. So you have to build up a cushion. Now, they're not sitting on that money. There's money being invested in treasuries. But basically, they're holding it as a contingency. If all of a sudden that contingency is not needed, those funds can very quickly be directed into the economy. The banks can start expanding, rehiring. You have a healthier financial system. I expect that the results would be immediate. Longer term, since he has endorsed the Ryan plan, I believe that there's an excellent chance of at least holding the line on government spending, possibly even coming down with some reductions. And also in terms of a tax policy, even in the Ryan plan, in spite of all these additional taxes, the marginal rates come down, which can have some positive impact on the economy. I would suggest that the government spending part at this point may be more important than restructuring the tax system, because this government spending and mandates are simply draining the system from too much. Now, what if I'm right on my election? In terms of the election, let me give you that. It's my belief that Governor Romney will win. And I know that is a very strange thing at the moment, other than perhaps having a bias, because if you look unbiasedly at the polls, if you look at the Electoral College, right now the president is ahead. If you look at in-trade, voting on in-trade and the betting on the presidential race, the president has about a 54% chance that he will be elected. So the odds are all there, including the polls. But if you dig down a little deeper and look at the specifics in the polls, what we find is that there are an inordinate number of voters who are undecided at this point in the election. We're 4.5 months or so before the election. And people have pointed out, this is like going to your spouse and saying, listen, in 4.5 months, you're going to have to make a choice as to whether or not you want to still be married to this person. And if your answer is, well, I'm not sure, that is not a good sign. That's not a very good sign at all. But there are some other things that I would look at here. One is that tax issue that I talked about before. I believe that there is the potential for the Romney administration to look at that 5 to 10% tax increase on everyone. This is from the first income you earn. Anyone earns the first $20,000, that tax bracket immediately goes up by 5 percentage points. And everyone pays that extra 5, and then on top of that, if you're above $20,000, it starts to go up by another 3% on that. I mean, there is an argument ready to be made that will scare the life out of people. And it's not the Democrats or the Republicans that you have to convince. It's the independents who basically are going to dictate the result of this election. By definition, if you're independent, you haven't paid attention to anything. You don't know what's going on. And so you have to deal with the independents. They're all concerned with pocketbook issues, the potential for their income, for them to have to start budgeting for a 5 or 10% cut in income next year if the president gets reelected. That is likely to scare people significantly. Secondly, I mentioned that the European problem is unlikely to get resolved. I think it's going to keep appearing in the headlines. The more it appears, the more the independents might start paying attention to this government spending. What's this about? Government spending is out of control? Just how out of control is it? That's what the debt's going to do. That's what interest on the debt is going to be. And they're going to come out, I believe, with an issue of who do I really think is more competent to control government spending and to make sure my tax rates don't go up. And I don't believe the answer they're going to arrive at is the president. And there is a third issue, and that's the issue of religious liberty that has popped up. And if you haven't done so, I urge you to read the statement by the Catholic bishops on religious liberty. It's an extensive and I think an extremely powerful argument for why they so oppose the health care mandates that are being handed down. I don't think they realized what they were doing when they favored giving government the ultimate power to make all health care decisions. I think it came to them belatedly, but once they realized it, they are making a very powerful, very strong stance. What happens if I'm wrong on the election result and President Obama gets elected? Basically, we follow Europe down the same path. They've been on this road for 20 years. They've got a head start, catching up very quickly. By some measures, we may have already caught up. But basically, it means economic stagnation. I think at the best, and at the worst, if things really start to get ugly, the economy starts to go down. So what should we do? If we do believe in a God, do we want to start praying that Obama gets defeated and Romney gets elected? I've never approached prayer in that way. I never felt I was that good at the details. I rather pray for the country, its survival, for liberty, for people's prosperity, and let someone else take care of the details of just how you arrive at that. But if you do pray, the only thing I would suggest is that you be very sincere, not like the old story of the fellow who was a pretty heavy drinker who was going to court in order to attend a very important hearing. And he couldn't find a parking space, and he was late for the meeting. And he's riding around the block, and he looks up and he says, God, I tell you what, he says, this is a very important meeting. Please, if you could only make sure there's a parking space available so that I can make the meeting, I will never take another drink in my life. And just at that moment, a parking space opens up, and he looks up, he says, never mind, God, I found it for myself. Let me stop there. Do we have any time for questions, Joe?
I'm sure we do, but I don't have a schedule in front of me. When do we need to reach?